Hi, Bob.
Hi, Daniel. How you doing?
Good. How's life?
I am not complaining at the moment. Let me
Nice.
introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, which appears both in streaming video and is available via audio podcast. You are Daniel Ingram, noted meditation teacher when you're not being a physician, which is your day job. You are author of the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, an unusually hardcore Dharma book. We'll talk about what that means. You also run the website Dharma Overground. Dharma, of course, refers to the Buddhist teachings and to the path that one follows in light of the Buddhist teachings, and has actually a number of meanings. Um, and I want to talk about a couple of things today. One thing I want to get to later is this question of whether getting more and more people into meditation is an efficient way to save the world, or a way to save the world at all. But I want to spend probably more time and start with the question of kind of the plausible range of meditative aspiration. I mean, people start to meditate with a variety of goals in mind. At what you might call the more therapeutic end of the spectrum, some people, they want to reduce stress, anxiety, anger management. Then at what you might call a more spiritual end of the spectrum, people want to get deep insights into the nature of reality. And I guess at the very end of that spectrum, according to Buddhist tradition, is enlightenment, awakening, nirvana. Um, different teachers give different guidance as to what we should aspire to. You say aim high, right? You're an enlightenment guy.
I'm saying that aiming high is certainly possible and that people can do it. I don't necessarily advocate that everybody aim high. Strangely enough, the while some people will not necessarily have a hard time aiming high also comes with some risks. The kind of meditation practices that make that more likely, at least in my view, there's some people have some controversy about this. Also, you're changing the operating system in some ways more dramatically while it's running. It doesn't always necessarily go well.
Mm-hmm.
So if 100 people came to me and told me, I had some reasonable amount of time to talk to them and say, should I do really intensive meditation practices, or should I be gunning for enlightenment or something like that? I wouldn't say yes to all of them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It depends a lot on who they are, sort of how they view the world, what their underlying skill sets are, what their goals are, what calls to them, and how well they handle emotions and unusual states of consciousness, and all of those sorts of things. So I think it's something that if you've got a reasonable foundation in ethics and are reasonably psychologically stable and can handle some complexity, then yeah, okay, sure. For those who that's not their core skill sets and they don't really have their psychological trip together, I might at least initially recommend some more foundational things to work on. If that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. So we should probably start by talking about what enlightenment is. But first, let's establish your credentials, or whatever you want to call them. I think you describe yourself as an arhat, right? Which
Do
which means, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It means an enlightened one, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Now,
Yeah,
is
sure.
that an officially? Are you officially credentialed? Is there someone who deemed you enlightened, or are you just calling yourself that?
So that's a good question. So the this goes back to when I was on a retreat in 2003 in April in Penang, Malaysia, and the abbot of that monastery, essentially, as much as they ever do anything like that, was using the word in a way that they don't generally do unless they think someone is in that sort of
So
territory.
he deemed you an arhat.
Yeah, so yes. And then since then, it's more than just that. So um, there's a group of us that think we've done something very, very similar, which includes noted meditation teachers that you've heard of. I don't want to sort of out them all, but it's more than that. So when you put out a title like that, it causes a lot of reactions. Some good, some bad, some very strange, and but it also people who think they've done something very similar to what you've done, who may be less hesitant to use that term, but still think they've done something in that general range of the the end of awakening will start finding you.
You mean
and
you mean they are hesitant to say it publicly?
yeah,
Okay.
so saying something like that publicly is pretty unusual. I mean, it's pretty unusual, even among people who have done it or done whatever it is I've
Yeah,
done.
no, you're
Um,
inviting blowback for
yeah.
sure.
So, but it also the people who also have, when you put out the phenomenology, so when you actually describe it, when you actually go, okay, here's my criteria, and here's how it performs in real life, and here's what it now feels like as opposed to how it felt before. And if you're pretty explicit about those sorts of things, then people who've done something similar to that will seek you out and find you. Go, actually, yeah, actually, that's pretty much what my life is like these days after my years or decades of accomplished practice. And these are teachers that you've heard of and people with books out that get good reviews and that kind of thing. So it's more than just a one guy said, oh yeah, I think this word applies to you. It's more than that. It's that phenomenologically, there's a certain set of transformations that when your experience has these qualities to it, and they are lasting and hold up, and they're not just some sort of temporary effective practice, then there are other people out there who also go, yeah, I'm not sure I'd necessarily use that word, but that's what my experience is like these days after my practice.
And so I take it by phenomenology, you mean the description of your consciousness kind of from the inside, so to speak. And I
Right.
gather that you compare notes. And
Oh, yeah.
I want you to tell us what you're all saying, you're all feeling. But first, let me be clear. I infer from what you're saying that this is not just a one-time experience. It's like, you're describing something that happened on this retreat in 2003. You're describing it as a state of consciousness that has endured.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, state of consciousness is sort of a funny term for it. So, it's a change in the basic perception of reality. So, it's almost like the way I like to describe it. Do you know the figure drawing where it's got, if you look at it one way, you see an old woman, and if you look at it another way, you see a young woman, and it's in some ways very much the same information. Just your brain can either go, "Oop, and I see it this way," or same stuff, and "Oop, I see it that way." And having seen it the two ways, the second way is vastly better, at least in my experience. It'd be hard to prefer the first way. And so the difference is that once things flipped over, whereas before it really seemed like something in this changing field of experience really was like a center point, like a doer, a controller, a reference point, a sort of a locus of consciousness somewhere in there kind of. And some people, point here or here, or wherever they point to. But before, it really seemed like there was a continuous Daniel vantage point. There really was a subject. There really was an agent. There really was some continuous thing in the face of a ridiculously transient field of, sensate experience. Now it seems the exact reverse. So now it seems that there's a whole bunch of phenomena where they are doing their thing in a very natural, causal, luminous, if you will, way. So everything seems to be where it is.
The things that you, so to speak, are observing are just, well,
So the sense of observation is gone, actually. So that's one of the
Right.
weird tricks of this. So it used to be there was this sort of centralization of intelligence or sort of localized cognition that really seemed to be going out and saying, oh, that. And there's still perspective, right? So based on the mechanics of how eyes and everything work, and there's still directions, but there's everything sort of now just seems to be clearly, naturally awake, if you will, where it's happening. So there's sensations in the back or the neck or just where they are. So there used to be this reference pointiness, this sense of this and thatness. And now there's just the all thisness, which is very transient, very natural, and it does that naturally. So that's the interesting thing is once I managed to flip the thing over and then stabilize that flipped over thing, the knot untangled itself, and now everything is just where it is, doing what it does, which is much nicer and seems vastly more clear than the way things were before.
So kind of in doctrinal terms, I mean, this sounds like what in Buddhism is called the not-self doctrine, that the idea that the self does not exist, that the self as we normally think of it is an illusion. And this is one of the central insights, I mean, particularly in Theravadan Buddhism, maybe the central insight that is said to lie on the path to enlightenment and lead to enlightenment, right?
So you definitely can. No self language is very helpful for describing this in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, my preference for no self or true self language these days is kind of pragmatic. So I kind of look at the person or the audience or the whatever I'm talking to and say, okay, how are they sort of playing things, right? If you play things too hard no self before you really get it, you can become really dissociative. You can become really sort of derealized. That's sort of like the dark side of no self points of view. Where almost like you're pushing reality away, or you're trying to escape everything, or you're saying, no, that's not me. And it sort of becomes actually an enhanced objectification or an exaggerated objectification rather than an integrated non-objectification, if that makes sense. So for those people, I actually might use more true self language. Not that that doesn't annoy the heck out of Theravada Buddhists, right? It does. Mm-hmm. But I'm more of a pragmatist these days who kind of plays it depending on the people in front of me. Well, so if go ahead, sorry.
Well, is this also related to there's a doctrinal difference between kind of mainstream Buddhism, at least, and Hindu thought, where the question is if there's a feeling that the bounds of the self have dissolved, the question is, should you interpret that as meaning the self didn't exist, which is what mainstream Buddhist thought would say, or as some Hindu thinkers would say, as that everything is one, and it's more a sense of the merging of you, or you are, well, I don't know if you want to say you are larger than you thought, but it's more a sense of merger.
Right.
And is that kind of what you're getting at?
And that's more Christian as well. So the Christians talk about dissolution in God. Mm-hmm. And you actually find a reasonable number of true self teachings more within the Mahayana and Vajrayana, though that gets really philosophically complicated, and they generally hate it when you say that. But
the second of those terms refers to Tibetan Buddhism. Is that
Well, Vajrayana actually refers to Tantra, which is Tibetan certainly, but also you find it in Shingon. Vajrayana, Shingon Buddhism. So but then, people most of the time mean Tibetan when they say that.
And then Mahayana, just for a little Buddhism 101, I mean, Mahayana is quantitatively the largest kind of Buddhist school if you kind of count up the total number of Asians, right? And then
I don't know that that's true. So I haven't done the count. So they certainly call themselves the greater vehicle. I don't know that it translates to greater numbers. So you've got, how many. If you added up Burma and Thailand and Cambodia and Sri Lanka,
which is Theravada,
and some in Laos, which is Theravada, which they would call Hinayana, although actually there's really good reasons not to use those kinds of terms, but they're kind of for historical and other academic reasons. But anyway, not to associate those in the same way.
There's these three schools. Mahayana is more like China. I think people would say Zen is ultimately in the Mahayana tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then Southeast Asia is more Theravadan, and then Tibetan is kind of its own. Is typically considered kind of a third thing, although I've seen it mapped as.
No, Tibetan considers itself within the Mahayana.
Yeah, well, I've seen that. I've seen that map. I've seen it both ways, taxonomically. I certainly don't know. But
and then there's the Vajra. So yeah, it gets complicated. But the basic practical point. So I like to. There's all the dogmas and the traditions, right? So I like to, but being a pragmatist, right? So that's kind of my thing. I like to pull it down to the individual practitioner and say, okay, in your practice, if you're really identifying with stuff tightly, and you really think of all this stuff as you, and you're really, this is my anger, this is my fear, this is my perspective, these are my decisions, this is my stuff, then learning to recognize thoughts arising independently or not independently, but dependently, but not dependent necessarily on some centralized you, is really useful. Or being able to see intentions arise naturally in front of actions, or to be able to say, oh, wow, these are the sensations that make up my emotions through my body and my mind, and these are the images that make up the stories and the audio version of the thoughts.
I don't have to own them, right? I mean, that's one common early useful perception of a meditator's. I don't have to kind of own you view it on the one hand, you're not distancing yourself from it, but in fact, in some ways, it's the opposite. You're willing to engage with it, and yet that leads to, in some sense, a more objective view of it and less of a sense of necessary ownership.
Right. So that spaciousness that can come with meditation, that little bit of perspective, that little bit of, wow, I'm not so tightly caught in this stuff, can be really useful. And you can keep taking that much farther than most people think. into good territory and bad territory. So the good territory is where you start to see everything just as naturally arising, flowing, transient, ephemeral, causal phenomena everywhere in the field, and that can actually take over everything and lead to, profound states of realization when it includes space and all of the body and all of the room you're sitting in and all sounds and everything. So that can be very helpful. And that's no self done well. And then there's also no self done badly, which is people really dissociate. They really become hyper, objectified, and they really are kind of push everything. That's not me. That's not me in this very I'm over here and that's all over there kind of way, which is really not the point. It's supposed to also come back around and include everything in a more balanced, equanimous way. So, so for people who are hitting it too hard, the like dissociative disconnection, push it away kind of way, the real aversive kind of way, which is sort of the shadow side of no self teachings, I actually might do something very Theravadanly annoying, but practical, and pull in a little bit more true self stuff and say, actually, you need to realize these are your feelings in your heart. These are your thoughts happening in this is your world, and to have sort of an embodied wisdom where you actually are taking some sort of connected, integrated ownership of this field. And by sort of balancing these two perspectives, you can come to something that actually really you can describe kind of through either language, but sort of both are true. And the true self part about oneness is problematic because it always sort of implies an I that's one with everything, right? So it usually involves some sort of, and it also usually involves some stable sense of stability, right? So it usually didn't quite hit hard enough home. So there are problems on both sides. True self teachings can become, they can sort of miss some of the beauty of the profundity of what the Theravada and pointing to no self is talking about. Just as the Theravada can become too dissociative and too sort of objectified and too kind of heartless and cold and analytical. So I would actually, which I would say would depend on who was in front of me and where I thought they were. And I would actually advocate the same for people's practice. So if you're going too far towards one side, you might, pick up Nisargadatta's I am that if you're really too dissociated. Or if you're really too identified, you might take a look at, Mahasi Sadho's practical insight meditation, for example.
So I am that, I gather, refers to this kind of ancient Hindu. Well, the formulation of that is that art thou, or whatever, right? I mean, the idea in Hinduism is there is this kind of universal soul called Brahman, and then the self is called Atman, and Atman is Brahman. That's the feeling of kind of merger, or you're calling it true self, right?
Sure.
And then Buddhism,
or self with a big capital S, or whatever.
Right. And it's a merger, and as you pointed out, that's kind of like Christian mystical experience, because that is a sense of kind of communion with the divine, a deeper connection with the divine. Buddhism, historically, Buddhism's main claim to distinction, in a way, is the denial that the self exists, right? I mean, if you start taking that away from Buddhism, then the question becomes, well, wait a second, why are you so special? Why do you get to be called a whole new religion, in a way, right? Because a lot of meditative tradition can be found in Hinduism as well, right? So, for whatever reason, this is you can really get people upset. You can get Buddhists upset if you say, oh, it's a feeling of oneness. They're like, no.
You can get non-pragmatic, well-practiced, dogmatic practitioners very upset by saying things like that. Yes, you can. That's true. Luckily, the better meditators all start to sort of get the more practical approach. So that's the nice thing. The better meditators, the people who really have some practice chops under their belt, can start to get a sense of when true self teachings are useful, when no self teachings are useful. So that's the thing, right? You can tell the dogmatist from the pragmatist, and you can tell the more seasoned people with more seasoned cushion time, or just more insight from whatever method, from the people who are just sort of locked into defending an intellectual dogma, right? Because experientially, when you actually start to use these concepts to actually investigate what's going on with enough hours, or enough just good quality practice, or enough insight wherever it comes from, people can start to understand these are more like things to point you in a direction or help balance you in some kind of way. I mean, even within Buddhism, actually, there are true self schools. So there are strains of Buddhism over the years that have taken some sort of luminous space field to sort of be some ultimate thing. And you even still find some of that today in schools of Buddhism that even sort of shouldn't be, usually due to teachers being at some stage of practice where that really seems compelling, and haven't really seen through that yet. Okay. Anyway,
let's get back to describing what it's like to be you and just spend a little more time in that. It's an inherently hard thing to do. I have found in talking to people like you. One thing I've heard more than one of them say is that it's kind of like there is a universal field of consciousness and they are just one point of access to it. They feel as if they are just one point of access to a universal field of consciousness. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I certainly know the phases in which people would say that, which is obviously kind of a condescending thing to have said. I apologize.
I was not going to point that out myself.
No, but it obviously is. So that was kind of horrible, and I'm sorry.
They're not quite to enlightenment then.
Well, no. There are all these flavors of it, and there are all these degrees, and all these. And I've been through stages of my practice where a field of luminosity that seems some stable thing, that seems some refuge, that seems some reference point, was incredibly compelling. And there are whole schools of meditative tradition that are based on this, and that beats the heck out of previous modes of existence. I'll take that over what nearly everybody on the planet has. That's like, 90% good, if that makes so to rag on its subtle dogmatic and experiential problems is pretty tweaky, right?
But this luminosity thing is not where you are right now. That's not where you would describe what you're experiencing.
Oh no, I just wouldn't describe that as the point, or I wouldn't describe that as a stable thing, or I wouldn't describe me as one point in that.
But you've been there. The luminosity
and it's aspects of what's going on right now. So luminosity
what does that mean? Like, what is that like? It's like things are shinier, or things are. I mean, why luminosity? Yeah. Why that word?
Well, so for one thing, like everything, including space, seems to have it's a really problematic thing to say, a light in it. So the light seems to be where the things are, even where space is all the way through. What I would add is a transient component to that, an ephemeral component to that. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say so you can get people who say like there's a stable luminous space and everything's sort of in that stable luminous space. I would throw out the stability part of the luminous space, but I would say space as a transient experience is luminous. I would say, so like there's a guitar pick, right? So it's green, and I don't see it any more green or any more bright, I think, necessarily than anybody else. There is something about the lack of processing it through a sense of this side that actually makes the visual experience more kind of complete, but it's a subtle tweaky point. But the point is the green is in the guitar pick or your screen. The green is in the pixels on your screen right now as you're seeing this, right? So if you're seeing this...
Well, that's what it looks like. I mean, strictly speaking, it's because the green isn't in it, and the green part of the light spectrum actually bounces off. But anyway...
Well, that's a little theoretical, but the experience is just of green pixels on your screen or my hand moving around, right?
Okay.
So if my hand is moving around, the quality of awareness in my previous mode, when I was like I was, and I think most people are, I don't know for absolute certain, but it seemed like there was still a central side on this side that was perceiving the screen on that side. And really, even though the hand was there, these sensations over here seem to be perceiving this hand here, if that makes sense. Now everything's just where it is. So these sensations on this side are where these sensations are, very transient.
And is there a little bit of a feeling
and the hand is right here. So it's more immediate, it's more direct, it's more complete, and it's in some ways more literal. So it's actually very straightforward. That in the seeing, just the seen; in the hearing, just the heard; in the in the thinking, just the thought. That line from the Udana is actually very, very accurately descriptive.
Yeah, of course, I would not deny that the hand is out there. That, as a factual matter, is the sense of it a little more like you are where the hand is when you perceive the hand?
No, the sense is here's the hand and here's these sensations over here. So it's really hard if you have a sense of I. It's like you've got to localize the I somewhere. Or how could awareness happen? Or how could consciousness happen? How could perception happen? It's a maddening problem to deal with. I get that. But just enough sensate clarity. So if you actually really start getting good at just building the wiring in your brain through practice or experience or whatever, that you become really clear about all the sensations on this side, lots of subtle thoughts and mental echoes of other phenomena and other things, and head and back and neck and eyes and sinuses and tongue and back of your throat and all this stuff. You get really good at all this over here, and you get really good at perceiving these things over here too. You start to realize each of these sets or patterns of unfolding sensations are just where they are, and they never actually needed a reference pointiness to be clear, if that makes sense.
And why is this a better way to live?
Wow. Okay. So it's vastly better. So I actually had a week where I was oscillating between these two perspectives about every hour or two. And every time
You mean
I
between
flipped,
what is my perspective normally and what is yours now?
well, I don't know that that's your perspective. Is it your perspective that
Trust
there
me,
seems to be a,
I'm pretty ordinary. I mean, I've been on
okay.
meditation retreats and had fleeting glimpses of things that you might recognize, but I'm just basically a person right now.
Well, I'm just basically a person in a lot of ways too. This
But
mammal is
no,
very, very
you're an arhat.
mammalian.
You're an arhat. I'm a person. But anyway, go ahead.
Well,
So
no,
so
it's actually the down to earthness of it would shock most people. So this is a very mammalian mammal. This frame, this body is very biochemical. It's very subject to ordinary stuff. The perspective on it is really different, but a lot of it's pretty ordinary. To say you're a person, I'm an arhat is really missing something about
yeah, and I mean
the ordinary humanity of
in
this.
a certain sense, it's a less presumptuous point of view because you're not viewing yourself as at the center of everything, right?
Uh, I still have my presumptuous tendencies that seem to be habitual,
Okay.
but
I want to get to that actually.
yeah.
How enlightenment should change one kind of morally, so to speak. But first, let's like why is this? What's better about the way you are? How does it change your level of happiness, the way you react to things? Does it change the way you treat people, or what?
Yeah, it does. So it did change a lot of some things, and it really did not change a lot of other things, and it modified a reasonable number of other things. And unfortunately, it's really hard to go into that. And we got 25 minutes remaining or something, or what, 30? This,
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
so
Well.
so here's what it didn't do. So I'm going to start with some of the didn'ts. It
Uh huh.
didn't eliminate all negative emotions.
Uh huh.
That's a big one. And one of the interesting things is these people who are like teachers who you've heard of crawl out of the woodwork and say, wow, I still have some negative emotions sometimes. The perspective is really different, but these things still happen. And the fact that perspective is really different allows you to have a lot more moderation of what's going on, a lot more space around what's going on in some way. It's sort
Well,
of
do the
loose
negative
terms, but
emotions have less of a grip on you than they might
oh
have
yeah.
in terms of compelling you to do things that you might later regret?
Oh yeah. So there's a proportionality to them. So before in the previous method, it was really easy to sort of like detune from most of my field and really buy into the story in some really contracted way that kind of enforced this blindness to most of a lot of what else was going on.
Mm-hmm.
It is really hard to do that now. I'm not saying totally impossible, but it's very different. This space, so this volume, is kind of the reference point, if you will. That's a strange thing to say. When the whole room or the whole extent of your experience becomes sort of the container, that's again the wrong word. It
Mm-hmm.
implies a permanence, which is not there, but it becomes sort of the reference point. And then all these little sensations like fear or anger or tightness or irritation, or wherever that occurs, are A, very transient, B, very clearly perceived, C, not contracted into, and D, proportional to everything that's going on. They're a really small, pretty quiet part of what's going on.
Right,
It would
because
be
you're
like,
identifying with more of the, I'm buying into the true self version of the
it's fine.
interpretation, but leave that aside. Because you're identifying with more of the world, they are proportionally smaller.
And that proportionality is actually a huge game changer. And that transience, the natural appreciation of the sort of transient, scintillating ephemerality within that is also a real perspective game changer and vastly better. So having oscillated for a week or so back and forth between the untangled way and the tangled, more contracted, more centralized way, I can tell you that viscerally, just in terms of what this mammal prefers, the non-contracted way feels a hell of a lot better. It's just like, oh my God, thank you. Like, wow, that was such a toxic pain in the ass to be like,
Yeah, I've been
you
there.
know, yeah. So
I
me
am
too.
there. Um, so,
So like it's painful. There's something really painful about that. And when you're not doing that, and the whole thing's just
hey,
kind of natural, and you're not feeling like I'm making all these decisions. You're not feeling like this whole of reality has to somehow be processed through this teeny linear point.
yeah.
Like it's like, oh my God, thank you. So it's a lot better, just viscerally, and in terms of emotionally, and that sense of, oh my God, I've got to untangle something, which was like that spiritual questiness really just dissolved. It's not like there's still not interesting stuff to pursue and concentration depths to deepen and moral stuff to work on and karma and,
Yeah.
thought
So,
patterns and habits and stuff. But whew,
so
that is a lot better. I would recommend it.
do you do do you have a daily practice that you think is important in sustaining this state of mind?
It doesn't seem to require anything to sustain it. That's the interesting thing about this versus everything that came before it, is it seems bomb-proof. Like nothing changes this. Like coming out of deep anesthesia, it's still decentralized. Like, I'm at my most exhausted, most tired after a 90 to 100 hour, work week. It doesn't change. Like nothing, no amount of fatigue or
How
anything
many
seems to retangle it, which is awesome.
so years and years of meditative work got you to a breakthrough point where it just became permanent?
Yeah. And I saw glimpses of it and hints of it and aspects of it before. And then finally one day, and then I was sort of oscillating in and out of it for really hard for about a week on retreat. And then one day I recognized, no, actually everything is it, which is a key insight, right? So everything naturally is it. And that wasn't just an intellectual insight. It was a visceral all the way through, sort of at the foundation of perception, automatically arises that way kind of insight. And that was so worth it. I just can't even explain how much better that was than the previous way, which despite all, had all these things I could do, I had jhanas and I had, these deep meditative experiences and I could, dissolve my mind into the formless realms and do all this stuff. But
and how many years of kind of meditating what intensity? Like, was it 10 years of doing 3 hours a day and sometimes doing 6-month retreats, or what, how would you just characterize it in capsulized form, the degree of your commitment?
So for me, I've kind of lost track of all my retreats. I can't, there's a period for which I'm not sure how much, but probably 8 or 9 months on retreat total. Doing somewhere between 14 and 20 hours a day, depending on how hardcore a phase I was in, and that was over 7 years or so.
It was that many hours when you were on retreat,
right? So when on retreat, and then in daily life, it varied depending on whether I was in grad school or whatever. But I was lucky; I got some of my my key insights when I was either not working that much or not working at all. In my 20s, right, when it was easier, I didn't have, stepkids and I didn't have my, physician degree. So I had more time, and there were periods, there was a year where I'd do 3 to 5 hours a day. And then, most years, after that, 2 hours a day. But at that point I had some finger hold on real territory, right? So I'd used retreats, and very intense, retreats where I just really followed the instructions all day long. I was one of these people who, for whatever reason, just had either tremendous faith or tremendous mobilized intensity of must do this. That like when I went on retreats, I was able to just do what the people on the front cushion said to do, to a large degree, and that really helped. So how many total hours? I don't know, but it was 7 years from what they call stream entry, or my first kind of taste of something sort of ultimate, to finally dissolving any sense of real center pointedness on retreat again, with some grad school and stuff thrown in there, right? I was.
And how long have you been at this point where it seems to require not much in the way of daily practice to sustain it?
It doesn't require anything. So.
And how long has this been?
13 years. So
well,
April 2003. So.
One another way to maybe flesh out the practical implications of this. So you're an emergency room physician.
Mm-hmm.
So does this influence the way you practice? I mean, maybe even the quality of your practice, but also the way you experience your practice compared to the way you might. I mean, an emergency room is a pretty intense place.
And particularly level 1 trauma center, stroke center, heart center, high volume, high intensity. We have a very unusually high level of acuity, which is how sick the patients are that come to us. So yeah, it's quite an intense job. So I became an emergency room physician after I had done this, if that makes sense. So I had finished medical school when I did this. It was before residency. So, and it's been kind of a while, so I don't have a good A-B comparison, if that makes sense. Okay. But I can tell you my general theories about what's different. So for one, my level of, well, I can get mentally fatigued like anybody if I burn this candle, at both ends long enough and hard enough. I think it has reduced my level of mental fatigue because reality is just more inherently interesting. Not filtering through that sense of center point just makes like, wow, look at that rash, or wow, look at that person, they're really suffering, or wow, look at that. There's a sort of a enrapturousness. It's not quite the right word, but there's more of a like, wow, reality is so something. It's compellingly, neatly, naturally something. It's got a, and that's much easier. So the center pointed way is more, you're more prone to fatigue and task fatigue. Not that I can't get task fatigue, but the sort of more diffuse way, or non-localized way, if you will, of looking at stuff. I think I don't get as fatigued as easily in terms of stuff. So I'm able to sustain a higher level of mental resilience.
Mm-hmm.
I think than at least I personally would have been able to otherwise. Now I have other colleagues who externally look just as mentally resilient and bright-eyed and cheery as me after a long, hard day. So it's hard to really compare, if that makes sense. I'm not saying I'm better than anybody else, but I can certainly say for myself, I'm quite sure I would have been fatigued much more easily in terms of compassion fatigue and in terms of cognitive fatigue in the previous mode than I am in my current mode, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and did you get these benefits in an incremental way along the path as well, like before the big breakthrough? When you were meditating a lot, was kind of your life better in this particular way?
Yeah, there were a lot of shifts along the way that occurred, but this is still, it's categorically different. It's a whole different order of way. But yes, some of those benefits did accumulate along the path, no question, just by meditative training. Yeah. So the thing is, there's this whole debate about how much of the path up to some big flip over, it sort of imitates aspects of it. And I would say a lot. So there's a lot of, you'd see it for a little bit or something like it for a little bit. You'd see aspects of it. You'd see hints of, oh, this is not me, or this is all me,
I
or
hope
this
so,
is
because if
whatever.
you're not getting that kind of reinforcement along the way, it's a hell of a 7-year gamble, or however long it is, right? I mean,
right. No, I spent 6 years actually where I could see it for about 90% of the field, 95. Sometimes it seemed maybe a teeny percentage, like where I was like, it's most of the way there, but it isn't quite. Something's wrong. Like it hasn't. Like there was this annoying like gadfly of duality that was like.
so you were an intensely motivated person.
Oh yeah, I'm an intense guy, so I also just naturally sort of that way in everything I do. But yes,
but
once I got a taste of it, it was like it like flipped some like hair on fire, as they say, mode where it was like, yeah, got to do this.
And what drove you to meditation in the first place?
So what drove me to meditation was actually crossing an experience I would call the arising and passing away. So the arising and passing away is an initial first sort of point of no return that a lot of people have. I actually had it as a teenager.
So for example, you mean like when you're witnessing your own thoughts or your own feelings and they just kind of rise and fall, or what?
Well, actually, this was more than that. So the arising and passing away in Theravadan parlance is a stage called the Udayabhaya Jnana, or knowledge of the arising and passing away, to get all Pali about it. And it's a common experience lots of people have. Most people have it spontaneously, or they have it during a yoga class, or they have it during some intense breath workshop. Or I know people who have gotten into this in the context of a Christian faith healer, or just walking down the street, where it's like all of a sudden, and it can have lots of characteristics, energy, kundalini stuff, vortexy stuff, profound feelings of bliss, weird expansions of consciousness, can happen in dreams, can be very sort of sexual and profound and powerful, and people think they're enlightened. But it's a sort of a like throwing at that first switch. It's almost like adolescence coming on, where all of a sudden like, something's different and something's, whoa, they've got some little chunk of wisdom, like some part of it. And a lot of them can see, wow, there's probably some rest of it. And it can call people out into looking for something, or philosophically, people above the arising passing away are more philosophically sophisticated than most people. If you, for example, if you're interviewing people about awakening, you're almost certainly above the arising and passing away. That's something people above the arising and passing away do, and so you must have had some experience along the way.
Wait. How do you infer that I must have had this arising and passing away thing?
Or you wouldn't be all interested in interviewing people about their awakening, and you wouldn't be grappling with these issues, right? So people above the arising and passing away, that's the kind of things they do. So at some point, you almost certainly, did you ever have some experience where like you suddenly like something shifted and you're like, wow, or oh my gosh?
Well, when I think I understand something I didn't understand before, it's a little bit of an epiphany. But I don't think that's what you mean. So far, I don't understand why it's called the arising and passing away, given the way you're describing it.
Yeah, so technically, so here you've got technical meditation language, so analytical technical meditation language. Technically, a person on retreat meditating in stages through mind and body, where they see thoughts as thoughts, cause and effect. They see intentions lead to thoughts. They, or actions. They see experiences lead to mental impressions. Three characteristics. They begin to notice that these things are transient, changing. Sort of, there's a tension about them. They get weird bodily stuff, and their bodily asymmetries, and neck gets tight, and jaw gets tight, and they kind of get the stuff. So it's three characteristics, and then they get to a stage called the arising and passing away, where a technical analytic meditator will notice what you might call individual phenomena in the center of attention arise and vanish. So they can see, they might experience chills in their body, or subtle vibrations, or pulses of energy, or they can get fascinated with Kundalini stuff. They might see the breath start to go, or they might start to see thoughts sort of pixelate into like, I am thinking a thought, or they might start to notice other tingling little fine blips of stuff arising and vanishing. And it's at that
Things
point,
that previously would have been imperceptible, they're at such a fine scale.
Right, and appeared solid and not with that fine-grained resolution. So it's actually a perceptual shift in the ability to resolve phenomena at a fine level. But in terms
so
of
you mean even like breathing, where suddenly it's like the texture of the breath is visible.
Lots of little intricacies.
Well, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so at some point you must have crossed into the arising and passing away, because those little fine-grained phenomena are something ordinary meditators, when they first sit down, generally can't appreciate. And a more seasoned meditator or trained meditator, or even just someone who's having this experience in daily life, through whatever other combination of experiences led them to have an increased ability to perceive things clearly. Lots of things can do that, right? Lots of things we train to do. We're training concentration. We're training perception of what's going on in front of us. We're training qualities of mind that can lead to these experiences, right?
Yeah, I mean, but it still seems like a strange phrase to use if that's what you're talking about. I had always taken that phrase to be connected to the doctrine of impermanence.
No, this is direct perception. So this is a direct perceptual thing.
Perceptions.
Right. So the
Why don't
stages
they
of
call
insight.
it that? Well, anyway, we won't get off on that.
I don't know. I wasn't there when they wrote this down a few 2,000 plus years ago. But you can look at the Abhidhamma if you're interested in where this comes from.
I trust you.
So anyway, but lots of people today have these very clear experiences of just subtle, okay, there's a lot of little sensations in my fingertip, or in my nose, or my mouth, or in the breath, or wherever, and they may perceive it for all kinds of things. And the arising and passing away is a stage, depending on what techniques you are doing, or no techniques, or how you come to it, can look like a lot of different things. But one way or another, it throws a switch. And from that point on, a person is what I would call on the ride, meaning that they're going to be on some kind of a quest, even if they don't know it. That questiness is going to be in there.
So you have experiences sufficiently intense and interesting, like on retreat or whatever, to sustain your inquiry.
Right. And actually the problem with passing the arising, passing away, people cross into the dark night. So often there's this weird sudden burst of intensity of inquiry, followed by this sort of crash into disappointment with worldly activities and all kinds of things. Right. So the arising and passing away leads to the dark night stages of disgust, misery, fear, a bunch of...
Yeah, the dark night, and we should distinguish this from, I don't think you're saying what another thing that happens, which is that you go to retreat, you have intense experiences, then you go home, it slowly fades, it's hard to sustain the practice, you try to meditate, pretty soon it's hard to focus on 3 consecutive breaths. That's one thing, but when you talk about the dark night, I think you're talking about something that can happen like on retreat, when you're still, in some sense, in the zone, but it just turns negative.
Actually, if you've crossed the A and P, you're going to be in the dark night on retreat or off retreat. Even if you cross the A and P in daily life, you're going to be in the dark night, even if you're not on retreat and have no technique. So actually the number of people who come to the Dharma Overground, or come to my book, or come to similar books, or start looking around, or sort of stumble into spiritual communities because they're kind of half-baked, right? They're halfway in, they're halfway out. They saw something, and now they've lost it, and they've lost the light, and they're like, what the heck? The number of people that stumble to churches and synagogues and mosques and whatever, like these spiritual questers, they're suddenly like, they get religion, or they get spirituality, or suddenly they're like super vegans, or they're suddenly like into yoga, or whatever it is. The basic phenomena of having a taste of it and then falling off of that and going, and that hunger comes out, and a lot of their ordinary stuff in their world doesn't look so good, but somehow this kind of stuff does, in some strain of it, or whatever they resonate with. That's a very common phenomenon. And if you start looking around and asking these people, wow, why are you on a spiritual quest? Did you have an experience? And if you look up the standard stuff that people have when they cross the arising and passing away, the percentage that can clearly recognize an event is very large.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons sites like the Dharma Overground are so popular, because these people are often looking around. Wow, what happened? I had vibrations. I had Kundalini phenomena. And they're Googling this stuff. Or suddenly I'm like all depressed and there's no great idea why. Am I in the dark night? And they find those terms and they start looking around or whatever. Or they start just being called to, wow, I've got to go find something. I've got something, right? And they start getting all into some tradition, right? These are people who, a lot of them have crossed the arising and passing away in some context, not necessarily on retreat.
Okay. Something I wanted to, I mean, time is passing here, but something I wanted to touch on a little is the question of whether enlightenment should entail moral improvement. Certainly, the Buddhist kind of standard literature suggests as much. I mean, you've got the Four Noble Truths. They point to the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path includes all kinds of moral guidelines that are very demanding. Right speech. You don't say anything negative about anybody, and so on. So
I'm not sure exactly.
well,
What it says,
certain
yeah.
kinds of malicious, what anyway. It's demanding, and moreover, I mean, separate from, and then maybe this is my question to you, because I think you're one who is not going to insist that there be this strict moral adherence that's part of enlightenment, right? I mean, that's your
so. So what I'm going to say about that is, first off, 3 trainings: morality, concentration, wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so morality training, virtue training is a training that supports awakening and a good spiritual life in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
How exactly strict you have to be about ethics or how traditional, that's a topic that we could go on and on about for a long time. But I can definitely tell you that hanging out with now I've got exposure to thousands of practitioners, right? And their deep reports and their, honest assessments as best they can, or dishonest, who knows, of their practices. I can tell you that I know people who have morality nailed and don't have any concentration or wisdom. I know people who have wisdom nailed, who don't have great concentration, really don't have great morality. And I know people who have very deep jhanas who may not be very moral and may not have much wisdom. And then I see combinations of all 3. So like the notion that perfection in one training will necessarily mean you have perfection or some great degree of mastery or competence or embodiment of the other trainings, I really don't necessarily think so. It'd be like saying, and it's not like there aren't some crossover skills, but the fact that one will necessarily perfect all the others, I don't believe those models, and I have lots of real world examples where they do not hold up. Anyway.
Okay, but the reason one might expect the connection,
they're connections, but they're not perfect connections like the dogma says.
But I mean,
they're definitely connections.
Taken kind of literally, the Buddhist prescription for overcoming suffering, or however you define dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, whatever, the prescription is to entirely let go of thirst, of grasping after things, right? Well, I mean, that's...
Wow. Yeah, so that's totally right. So that's in there. And then what is that thirst they're pointing to? So lots of ways to think about that. From a moral point of view, I'm, lusting after my neighbor's wife, or I am lusting after drugs, or I am lusting after money, or I am lusting after power, or whatever, right? So,
yeah.
Or I am, that's the desire aspect, right? That thirst aspect,
almost all behavior we call morally bad involves thirst for something,
right.
Desire for something. That's why I'm suggesting there would seem to be a natural connection.
Yes.
If letting go of thirst is part of enlightenment, in fact, arguably is enlightenment, why isn't there a stronger connection?
Sure. And then the question would be, can enlightened beings, say, have sex with other people? Or can enlightened, to various degrees? Or, could enlightened beings ever tell a lie, even if they thought it was a skillful thing to do? Or could enlightened beings ever say a harsh word? Buddhists have plenty of harsh words, for example. And there are plenty of, Tibetan tantric yogis who, sex is part of their practice, and plenty of married people who are very awakened, who I know who still are able to, have sex with their partners.
You take the kind of logical point that you would imagine that if I mean, maybe the natural reply to what you're saying is, well, then they're not enlightened. They haven't let go of all. I mean, when the ancient text said nirvana, they're talking about just sitting there, okay? It's just like,
yeah, it doesn't look like that in real life. So the Buddha was an extraordinarily active guy, right?
Well, but he
said a lot of harsh things, and he, got irritated by his order when they pissed him off.
That may be an internal contradiction in the Buddhist story, but
Kinda.
anyway, you take I'm sure you've encountered this argument that
Yeah. It's a common one. I
yeah
get emails about the stuff all the time.
yeah
Yep. It's a common debate. I would say from a pragmatic point of view. So, because again, I'm a pragmatist, right? I like I mean, the theory is cool. Like, I can talk theory all day long, but the pragmatic stuff, let me get back to what I care about. So, pragmatically, I can tell you that people who have, in general, their psychology trip together and their personality trip together and their kindness trip together and their compassion trip together are vastly more fun to hang out with than people who don't, right? Who, who would I appreciate hanging out with more? The people who are, you know, more reasonable people, more kind people, more thoughtful people, more empathic people, more decent people. Like, and decency is a funny thing. I'm not necessarily advocating some rigid code of thou shalt never do anything fun or puritanical thing, but you know what I mean, right? So like these people who have their morality trip together, they're a lot more fun to hang out with. They do better in their practice. When they hit hard stages, they do a whole lot better. They're more balanced in the face of complicated restructuring experiences. They have better interactions with their teachers and fellow meditators. Like, pragmatically, like who what do I think's better? Yeah, some sort of basic sense of you got it together. You're a good person. Like, yeah, I'll take this any day over someone who is the opposite of those things, right? Mean, cruel, vicious, heartless, terrible,
yeah. I'm with you. Terrible is bad.
Yeah, terrible is bad, good is good. I'll take, so I'm advocating for this. I wouldn't necessarily block it off in exactly the rigid way that a 2,500-year-old monastic tradition from India would block it off. But we're on a lot of the same pages when it comes to core stuff, if that makes sense. Our differences are relatively trivial, And have I noticed some tendency among people with deep insights to have more emotional balance given certain stage constraints? Yeah, and be more decent people. Yeah, and be more trying to help people. Yeah, and have more space around their stuff and more of ability to process it skillfully. Yeah, definitely. Is it a perfect correlation? No. And perfect is often in the eye of the beholder, right? So usually people with some perfect vision of exactly how enlightened beings should be, or they have their own internal, very strictly drawn picture of exactly what an enlightened person would say or be or do at any moment that is based on their conditioning. And some people can sort of rigidly apply that internal, sort of almost universal, like, like Plato's universals or whoever came with universals. They would put in some Platonic sense, this is the enlightened being, and they hold everything else up to that, their own internal standard of exactly how they'd move, speak, say things.
Okay.
I think it's kind of naive. It doesn't hold up to reality testing very well.
Okay, so final topic. We're running out of time, but I promised to get to this a little, and this leads into it naturally. So let me just ask a kind of specific version of the question. We had talked about whether meditation can save the world, so to speak. And there are people who do the practice, and they say that what's going to save the world, what's going to end the war, what's going to solve global warming and everything is if we get enough people to meditate, then, the world will no longer be dominated by people who do these terrible things, who consume too much, who start wars and so on. But I have noted, it seems to me there's a and like, I grant that maybe if you got the whole world on this wavelength, that might be a significant improvement. But meanwhile, here's the problem. That's going to take a long time. B, meanwhile, it seems to me there is the real possibility that meditation can make people less drawn to activism, to the kind of political activism that could directly assault the problems. Because after all, Buddhist philosophy the Buddhist program could be described as a way of making people, in a certain sense, completely indifferent to their surroundings. I mean, that's not the way you described your experience, but it is, being no longer subject to the lure of desire and no longer pushed by the kind of prod of aversion. I mean, that's fundamental to the teaching. And in a way, right, it's a prescription for just going, I can live with anything. I can be anywhere and be happy, and you can see how that could lead one to think, like, why bother to change the world if I'm already happy here, right?
So that's so the weird thing is, once you dissolve the boundaries true self or no self, wherever you describe it, one of the things you immediately recognize is, oh my golly, this world is the whole thing. This is the whole of experience. This is what's going on. Everything in my experience is actually the experience. That's a straightforward statement that actually has an unusual degree of profundity to it. And then you recognize that causally, everything that's happening in the world affects everything in this field of experience. And that naturally brings some sense, wow, I better make this field of experience a good one. And that means the world, right? From your sort of solipsistic point of view.
If you might.
Right. So causally, even if you're a purely selfish bastard, like a bad world is a bad place to live in, right? A good world, better place to live in, right? So I myself am very politically active. If you notice, most of my tweets are all political activism. I'm a big screaming leftist. I have a monthly donation to Bernie. Auto deducts out my account. And actually a lot of my friends who are into this stuff are pretty politically engaged with their families, with their communities, with service, with environmentalism. There is some association. It's not perfect, right? And it's not like everybody will certainly suddenly adopt leftist, eco-friendly politics when they suddenly become awake. And I'm not saying that doesn't seem to be true, but some sense of, wow, this world is the point, right? And the bodhisattva ideal is huge in Buddhism. We should save all beings and reduce suffering everywhere. It's huge in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And the Buddha himself, would walk hundreds of miles just to find people he thought he could make their lives better, and advocated for a radical restructuring of the Brahmanistic and caste-based society he found himself in, and was a real activist for that. And there are lots of dialogues where he talks about, where he rails against the caste system and injustice, and so there's a lot of that in there. And
okay, well then I'm more hopeful now, although I know your aspirations for meditation saving the world are actually not extreme. I think you are guarded in your own hopes. But anyway,
no, I'm only guarding my own hopes because think of the number of people being born. Think of the number of people being born into horrible circumstances, serious crushing poverty, tremendous hunger. People get cranky when they get hungry, and understandably so. People get cranky when they can't get water. People get cranky when there's profound social injustice. There will be conflicts over scarce resources. It's all, fun and good from an upper middle class, Western safe country perspective to say, oh yeah, everything's going to be fine. But if you spend enough time in most of the world, or even just read the news, you recognize, actually, we got a lot of hard problems with 7 or 8, 7 point whatever billion people on the planet now. That's hard resource conflicts. That's hard stuff. And, people being born every day that have serious personality disorders, that have tremendous delusion, that are in horrible circumstances, that are molded by terrible causality, that's going to make them people who are going to do a lot of bad stuff in the world just trying to be happy, right? Mm-hmm. So even if you assume everyone is just trying to be happy, still the way people pursue that happiness en masse is often pretty bad, as the news tells you. Not there aren't lots of good people in the world, but the number of sociopaths or people with any social personality disorders, now the more polite term, or whatever it is, or narcissists, or there's a lot of people in this world who come into this reality at a mode that is pretty destructive, right? And I don't see how you eliminate all that. I don't see how you instantly change all that. I don't see that just meditation is enough. We have to do a whole lot more on this planet, right? We do. As a species, to make this all work out some long-term sustained way.
We do, but my own view is that one of the biggest problems facing the world is just the psychology of tribalism. It's my group versus your group. It completely warps your thinking. We're seeing it in America ideologically.
You're seeing it in meditation.
Well, yeah, you Dharma wars and so on, but I think it's a big one, and I do think, notwithstanding what you just said about meditators, in fact, being prone to it and so on, I do think that at its best, meditation, and at your kind of deepest level of insight, it gives you a kind of a distance from that allows you to see kind of the absurdity of it, and to be less drawn into it. I'm not saying it's some kind of miracle cure, but don't you? Do you see what does that make sense to you?
So initially, that objectification of experience, that spaciousness around things, is a predominant part of a lot of people's experience. They have more space around thoughts. When the thing untangles, the whole thing becomes integrated. Everything is just where it is. That's very different in some ways than having space. In some ways, it's sort of the best space around things, and in other ways, it's ridiculously intimate. So that intimacy drives engagement, right? So the intimacy of experience now, everything is intimate with itself. So the the curious reason that one of the reasons the center point doesn't want to sort of dissolve into all this and realize what it actually is because it wants that distance, right? So, but when the whole thing dissolves and everything just is where it is, in some ways it's sort of transcendent, if you will, but the experience is actually very intimate, very integrated, very immediate, very clear. And so this space is sort of everywhere, but the intimacy is also everywhere. And so that intimacy drives engagement because, then you're sort of a part of everything from a true self.
So are you not less tribalistic in your psychology than you were before you started meditating?
I don't think I'm as tribalistic, which is why you'll notice I sort of have this way that kind of looks at the what I think of as, from my vantage point, or whatever, the best stuff, right? From my conditioning, from my
the vantage point of your not self, yes,
or whatever.
Yes.
See what I mean? Like, so it makes it easier to look at the various traditions and go, actually, that's really good. Like, that's a good thing. That would be useful for counterbalancing this person's or this, tendency to whatever. And wow, that's a great technique. Or I really like that. Oh, that's skillful. I can see a situation that would be a useful teaching to apply in some practice setting, right? So it has given at least me a point of view that, like, I like to sort of try to figure out what are the gold nuggets and what are the things that you can apply to various circumstances, to various people in various stages in their practice, given certain sets of conditionings that will help them counterbalance whatever is keeping them, knocking them off their game, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there because of owing to time. Maybe we'll have another conversation down the road. There's a lot we have not explored. But meanwhile, your book is Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And what is your Twitter handle? We'll put it on the site in any event, but why don't you tell people?
Yeah, so Daniel M. Ingram, Ingram, Daniel M. Mike as in Michael Ingram.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I will let you get
Been
back.
Fun.
I will let you get back to being either everything or a not self, depending on how we interpret your experience.
Cool, and I hope your own practice goes very well. And anybody watching this, I hope this has been in some ways helpful.
We have some work to do on my own practice, but
do it.
Yeah. Well, okay. Thanks a lot.
Bye, man.
Bye.
Thank you.